Hey, data pipeliners, welcome back to another episode on Writing Data Pipelines with Kedro. Today, I've got a really special one for you guys. This is the Kedro plus Great Expectations redo. Uh, we're going to be taking a look at the more extended features about Great Expectations. And so here's the thing with the last video that we did on Great Expectations. It's a pretty good introduction for like how you can start to operate with Great Expectations, how you can start to add it to your pipeline. But you'll quickly notice two things. Number one, it's very hard to scale that kind of expectation. If we continuously write nodes for every single data set to do our expectations, it's going to take a while, right? Plus, number two, we're not taking advantage of some of the features that Greater Expectations has. Namely speaking, Greater Expectations, sorry, I keep saying Greater Expectations. Greater Expectations comes with data documentation as well as profiling. So it has the ability to automatically profile your data to create expectations for you, and it also has the ability to generate documentation based on those expectations, as well as the validation results from those expectations. And so in today's video, I'm going to show you some more of the features of Great Expectations, as well as a special Kedro hook that I created for Great Expectations based on some of the fantastic work by Lim Hoang, who's one of the engineers on the Kedro team. So let's go ahead and take a look. We're going to start off by seeing exactly what are some of the tools that Great Expectations comes with. So Great Expectations actually has a fantastic API, and let's go ahead and open it up inside of a terminal really quick. So here we are inside of this Great Expectations. You should be able to see my terminal here. Um, and from here, what we'll do is we'll actually just split this up here so that you guys can we'll make sure that it's always inside of view. And let's go ahead and get started here. So with Great Expectations, it comes with its own command line. So after you install Great Expectations using pip install Great Expectations, you are given access to the command line utility. So Great Expectations has its own command line utility. And when you first create a project, actually Great Expectations doesn't have any knowledge about any of your data sets, right? So what you want to do first is you want to initialize a project with Great Expectations. So we do our init here, and it creates this new directory structure inside of your local directory. Specifically, we want to create it inside of our Kedra folder. We're going to go ahead and click yes here to create that folder structure. And it then asks us, do we want to configure our data source? And so the data sources inside of Great Expectations are basically the capabilities of very similar to how Kedra has its own data sets. Great Expectations also has its own kind of data sources. And so these have specific connectors as well as folders where you can find data. And so Great Expectations supports many of the same file systems that Kedra also supports. And in this case, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating two data sources. The first data source is going to be basically just our pandas data source. So it's a very simple pandas data frame, very similar to that. Where it will look inside of our O1 raw data folder for, of course, our beloved iris data set. And so we're going to call this data source pandas data. So it's the pandas data source. And now that we have this pandas data source, we now need to create a new data asset underneath that data source. So this is the particular data set that we are creating here. And so the data set that we're going to be creating using this data source is going to be an iris data set. And so it already knows to look inside of our data folder, the raw data folder, and it knows how to find that iris data. And so we're going to go ahead and say 1 in order to get our iris data file, and it's going to create a new expectation suite. So the naming convention here is kind of interesting. It says iris.warning, and the iris.warning actually creates a folder path based on that dot. So it's going to create an expectation folder path that is iris slash and then warning.json, and it saves the expectation as a JSON file. So the JSON file effectively describes all of the expectations that we want to assert for this data set. So this is very similar to how we created um, our node, which has the expectations built in into that node in the last video. In this case, we're going to be creating a JSON file that lists all of those expectations as well. Now, what I want to do here is I'm going to name the expectation similar, in fact, exactly the same as our data set itself. So we have two data sets that I'm going to be showing you. One of them is the Pandas iris data set. So we got Pandas iris data, and it'll save it as is Pandas iris data. And then we have another one where it's called, it's going to be a Spark data set. And let's go ahead and automatically build the documentation right now. So we're going to go ahead and build the documentation, and it's going to open up the documents. And so this is so cool. I love this part about about Great Expectations, and that it generates this fantastic looking documentation. And so here, let me go ahead and make this bigger for you. And so here we have our Great Expectations. It comes with some of the instructions. We're going to go ahead and skip the instructions for now, but you can take a look here. Great Expectations has already done a profile analysis on our pandas data. So it knows exactly what columns we have, right? It knows the values for each of the columns, right? So we have sepal length, for example, and it already does our like min, our max, our mean, our median, our quantiles, and it does this for every single column. So for example, species as well. Species has these has assertions where the values must never be null. It's 100% not null. We have distinct values in this particular list. And then it also shows us some really cool analyses on like divergence and etc. So you can see here immediately just all of this power within Great Expectations. And what's really important here and what's really fantastic is that these expectations are already set for us. We have these expectations, and now if the data changes at all, then the expectations will not be met, and we'll be able to see that erroneous expectation. And so just to prove that this actually works as intended, what we're going to do is we're going to modify right here one of our data values. We're going to change Setosa to DE1 and then rerun our expectations. So we're going to say run sweet pandas iris data using the iris. And then what's happening here is that it says validation failed. And so when we run our docs build, we're going to get a new version of our docs. And then you'll clearly see here, oh no, there's a little red X. If we click inside of here, we'll see that the distinct values must belong to Setosa, versicolor virginica, and oh no, we have DE1 inside of our flower species. So you can see how powerful Great Expectations is. So you can make sure that your data is the correct form that you need it to be. Now, the next question is, how do we get this working with Kedro? Well, that's a really good question, and I will show you how we do that. So what I've done here for you guys is I've written a special custom data set that will actually go through, and it's based off of Lim Hoang's data set, mind you. And you can see here I have leftover Lim Hoang's code, but all it does here is it'll go through and run your validation, right? It'll run a dataset validation before a node runs. And so what happens is it'll take the catalog as well as the node that's about to run, and using the inputs for that node, what it's going to do is it's going to run the validation suite on those inputs. And when it runs it on those inputs, then it's going to generate that validation and then give us an output just like we saw with our documentation. We just have to build our documentation one more time. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but suffice to say that what it does is it replicates the way that Great Expectations generates its validators, and then it runs the pertinent class of data set based on the data type that we have. And so this supports Pandas and Spark, which are actually two different data sets that Great Expectations uses. So that means if we do a Kedro run for our simple pipeline, and inside of our pipeline, we just have two nodes. One of the nodes uses the Spark iris dataset, and the other node uses the Pandas iris dataset. And again, inside of our catalog, our Pandas iris data and our Spark iris data, very simple. It's just one Pandas CSV dataset and then a Spark dataset. One extra trick here is that since we're reading in from our local CSV file, we need to add another load argument for the Spark iris data in order to make sure that it catches the header. So when we do a quick Kedro run, we're going to see an output that displays the Spark as well as the Pandas descriptions of the dataset, which should be the same thing since that's how they are. And so here we have our descriptions. We have one for, this is from Spark, and then I believe the one for Pandas might not have shown up here inside of the output, but that's okay. So now that we've run that, what we're going to do is we're going to rerun our Great Expectations build documentations, docs build. And what's going to happen is we're going to get a brand new output inside of our documentation. So let's go ahead and open our documentation. And here it is, the brand new run where we have our data from Pandas iris dataset. Right, so we have our Pandas iris data. And you can see here it's still broken, and that's because, of course, I did not change back our DE1 status here. So let's go ahead and change that back, and we'll rerun the pipeline just to show you guys that it works. And once we do that, the next thing that I'll do is we'll create another data asset, data source for Great Expectations, so that it can do the same thing, the profiling on the Spark data as well. And now what's interesting here is that the way that the default Spark loader runs is that it actually doesn't use, it doesn't have like some of the arguments put into place. And here it is. If you look below me, you can also see that the status here is totally true. So let's go ahead and so the commands that I just used there was just another simple Kedro run after fixing the DE. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a new data source, and this is going to be for Spark. So let's go ahead and use Great Expectations. So what we want to do is we want to do data source new. It's going to be a new data source. It's going to still point on our file system, and we're going to be using PySpark for this. The path is again going to be our 01 raw, and the data source name is going to be Spark data. And then that looks correct. We're going to go ahead and proceed. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create a new suite. So once we've gotten the data source in, we're going to create a new suite. And this suite is going to be based on the Spark data that we just generated. And then it's going to ask us what the data asset is that we want to use. And the data asset that we want to use, of course, is the file that's on disk. And then now the new expectation that we're going to be generating here is going to be called Spark iris data. So again, this is an expectation that is matching the catalog name. Now, what we can do is we can actually do some special things that the hook supports, where you can map your catalog name to the expectation that you want, and also support multiple kinds of expectations that you're looking for. So like dot warning or dot info, or like dot error, critical, etc., etc. But just for the sake of this video, we're going to keep it simple and use Spark iris data. And so now we've created our Spark iris data, and now here's something cool that that Great Expectations does in order to figure out exactly what is the expectation you are using. When you create a new expectation, it allows you to edit that expectation, and you can edit it later, of course, but it allows you to edit that expectation based on a Jupyter notebook. And this is like such a cool feature, I think. Let's go ahead and take a look at the expectation though. We should see the expectation popping up right below me. And here it goes. And here we can see it generates a notebook that allows you to add in your expectations. And so if you look at this notebook, the code is actually exactly the same as we had for our nodes. So the nodes that we created previously, you can still reuse those expectations and then generate the JSON expectations using this notebook interface. But I want to show you guys here is that this notebook, when you use when we load up the Spark dataset, there actually is a little bit of a mishap. And you can see that right here in our column list. The column list is C0, C1, C2, C3, C4. So let's go ahead and actually fix this problem. Now, where did this problem come from? The problem comes from the fact that when we load the Spark data using Great Expectations, it doesn't use the header option. And so you actually need to manually add that header option inside of the expectations. So if we go ahead and run this guy, we should be able to see what Great Expectations sees when it loads data. And so we can see here, it sees that the sepal length, the header actually does exist, but the width but the header is incorrectly placed. So let's go ahead and like zoom in here so you can take a look a little bit more easily. Now, in order to support this header and any other Spark operations, what you want to do is you want to go ahead and add a new item to this batch quarks. And so this is the reader options argument. And this allows you to modify the behavior of whatever reading function is being used. And so in this case, they're using a Spark data frame reading function. We're going to modify it such that it'll read the header, and you can see right here, sepal width, sepal length, petal width, petal length, species shows up correctly. And now what we need to do is we just need to modify our column list. But actually, let's go ahead and instead of modifying this column list, let's just leave the expectation as it is. We're going to leave the expectation as it is, and we're actually just going to run the pipeline. And so what I want to show you is I just want to show you that in truth, the pipeline does work. The hook is actually now automatically, because we've generated the expectation, the hook is automatically reading from our Great Expectations folder and is matching that Great Expectation to the dataset. And in this case, the dataset is the Spark Iris dataset. So let's go ahead and do Kedro run. And now when we're running it, we're loading. We're getting all the data out and generating, of course, our PySpark context. And then let's go ahead and while that's done, we're going to do our Great Expectations docs build. And we're going to build the docs one more time. And we should see two new expectations that are created, or two new validations that are created inside of our documentation. And we can take a look here, and here they are, the two new validations. The first one being Pandas Iris data, which is green, status green. We can actually see, we can filter here. And the Spark Iris data, which is, status red. And if we click inside of here, we'll see exactly why it's status red, and it's because the column names doesn't match. And I do want to note though, the reason why the column names don't match here is actually not because we modified this guy right here, actually. The truth is that this reader option, or these batches, are actually ignored by the Kedro hook. The Kedro hook actually reads directly from the catalog.yaml file, which means if we modify the catalog YAML file to remove that header option, then you will see it does work. So let's go ahead and just remove this header true from the Spark Iris data, and then let's do a Kedro run right here, and then rerun the Great Expectations. Great Expectations hook, and then we're going to go ahead and rebuild the documentation. great expectations docs build. And so the Kedro run has just completed. We're going to rebuild the documentation and we'll see that both data sets are actually going to be fine. So if you look right below me, once the documentation loads up, we'll see that we have the two greens. And so notice again, that's not because we changed anything here. It's because the Kedro hook is utilizing the catalog, the actual catalog entry data set in order to load that data. Let's go ahead and fix that data set really quick inside of our Spark Iris data configuration file. So now that that's fixed, and then let's also change up our data set inside of the Jupyter Notebook. And now I think this is a really cool feature by Great Expectations. It really makes the interface very easy to approach in order to write your expectations in this manner. And that's because it allows you to experiment very quickly with the data that you're operating on. So we have here, for example, like for these table expectations, we should be able to just pull out, anything from these table expectations as we desire. Let's first go ahead and just modify this variable here. We can actually pull out the column list directly from the validator itself, and then we'll just replace that here. And so now we've created a new expectation, and that expectation has a success of true. And so this should look familiar as we did in the last video. Now what we're going to see is that these column expectations are actually also going to fail. And if we take a look down here, that is the case. Cannot resolve column underscore C0. But instead, what we can do is we can just modify that, and this column 0 should actually just be sepal length. So if we change sepal length here, we can also modify the header as well, and then which should have a true response. This is success true, success true. And let's go ahead and add one more expectation, and that expectation will be for species. And we're going to say, we're going to just make sure that the species column contains exactly those values of Setosa, Virginica, and the last one. So we can say column values must be in set. So we can say column values to be in set species, and then the set we can actually steal from the last from the pandas version of that data set. So we can go ahead and just say we want these guys inside of there. Setosa, versicolor, Virginica, and let me just zoom out really quick to make sure that I have the parentheses in the right spot. We can go ahead and run this guy, and there it is. Success is equal to true. And so now we have we have not only our updated column expectations, but our new column expectations for species. All we have to do is we go to this the last cell in the notebook, and we just run this cell. And by running this cell, Great Expectations is going to save our expectations into our JSON file. And so we're going to click run here like this, and our expectations are now being saved. And I think that's just such a fantastic, awesome way in order to have our expectations put into place. And so what it does is it also rerun our expectations, and it shows us the success or failure, and we can see here status succeeded. And now if we were to rerun the pipeline one last time, we should be able to see that the expectations will run. So we're going to do Kedro run one more time, and then we're going to rebuild the documentation once that is complete. And so that's going to run, run, run. There we go, rebuilding the documentation. Hit yes here, and the documentation should pop up with our brand new suites, our brand new runs, and our wonderfully validated data, validated with the greatest of expectations. And so here they are with the most recent run. And if we look inside of the Spark Iris data, we're going to see our sepal length, sepal width schema, and then our sepal length, as well as our species validation. And now we can rest assured that our data is going to be safe and sound and protected from any kind of external modification. Thank you very much for joining me. If you watch this entire video, make sure you hit that button, which indicates that you like it, and that helps me know that you guys like this content and helps the YouTube algorithm also tell other data pipeliners like yourselves out there more information about these kinds of videos. And again, I love it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you guys learned something, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care. Bye bye now.